In this video, we're looking at a subscriber recommended topic, grieving when there is nobody to say goodbye to. Now, I know there will be people who say, what does it matter? I don't care what happens to my body when I'm gone. Throw me in the garbage for all I care. And they seem to think that's a very enlightened thing to say, completely forgetting that you're dead. You aren't grieving. Your family can see you at the morgue, and in theory, they could pick you up and dump you in the bin out back. But they would have chosen to do that, and they know where they put you. It's an entirely different situation when you have no control over what happens to your loved one's body and you're left in the dark about where they are or what happened to them. Or you know what happened, but there's no body left to say goodbye to. This type of grief is marked by uncertainty and a lack of closure, and it's something that often gets swept under the rug. Today we're going to explore what it's like to grieve without a body, how it complicates the emotional and psychological process of mourning, and why this type of loss is so uniquely painful. Before we begin, we post death and dying related videos every Friday, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk grieving without a body. Grief in and of itself is already complicated and a deeply personal experience. But when there's no body to mourn, the grieving process becomes infinitely more difficult. It's one thing to say, I don't care what happens to my body when I'm gone, but it's another when your family has no choice in the matter and is left grappling with the reality of never knowing what happened to their loved one. When you lose someone and there's no physical evidence of their death, the grief doesn't just feel like an absence, it becomes a void of unanswered questions. There's no funeral, no place to say goodbye, no closure. This experience is perhaps most poignantly felt by families of people who have died in tragic and violent circumstances, where their body is either missing or destroyed beyond recognition. Think of those people blown up by missile strikes in war zones, those involved in plane crashes, events like 9/11, or the many people that go missing, often murdered. The pain of knowing your loved one has died is compounded by the terror of not knowing where they are, not being able to say a final goodbye, or to even provide them with a proper burial. This type of grief is called ambiguous grief. Though I should point out there are many scenarios that would result in ambiguous loss and grief, including those where the person is still obviously very alive, but we can do a video on that another day. But in this situation, grieving without a body, ambiguous loss is described as losses that are unclear or unconfirmed. Ambiguous grief is therefore the psychological period you go through to adjust to your new normal. Remember this video we did if you need clarification on the difference between grief, mourning and bereavement. As we said there, grief is not about getting over a death. It's about learning to adjust to a new normal without that person and learning to accept that. And it's the acceptance part that is particularly difficult with ambiguous grief, because in this situation, there will be no closure and people need to find a way to cope with the absence of truth and fact. And it's more difficult if someone goes missing, assumed murdered, because people cannot cope with a problem until they know what it is. And in this case, they don't know with 100% certainty that their loved one is dead. So you naturally go into grief because you haven't seen them in 5 years, but you can't fully go through the process because you're not even 100% sure that they're dead. In this case, resilience means increasing one's tolerance for ambiguity. Now, before we go into how the family may cope with this situation, let's look at a few examples I mentioned earlier. Because in all those cases, there is nobody to say goodbye to. But there are various different factors at play in each situation which will affect families differently. And I'm going to go through this like you are a loved one in this situation. So if you're not okay with that, turn off now. Examples. First up, let's look at 9/11 and the planes that flew into the 2 World Trade Center buildings. Say your loved one, like many of those that day, was a regular worker in one of those buildings and had been for many years, meaning they went there 5 days a week during business hours. You know their routine. They may leave the building for lunch or the occasional meeting, but you know they will spend most of their business day in that building. So already, if something happened to that building, you would have a certain amount of doubt whether they were actually in the building or not. Now, the attack on the first building was at 8:46 a.m., the second at 9:03 a.m. You know their work started at 9 a.m. So had they arrived at the building or not? They might have been late for work, you don't know. This is New York and traffic is notoriously a nightmare. And this is where this type of grief can go in a few different directions. Say your loved one had an early meeting that day, so they got there at 8:30 and they gave you a call when they got to the office to chat, meaning that you knew they were in the building. So when that plane hit, you had a pretty good idea that they were in the building, But at the same time, they could have gone out for a quick coffee. But more likely they didn't, because they had that important meeting at 9 a.m. and you haven't seen them since. So you can be mostly sure that they were in the building at that time when it was attacked and they died and their body was destroyed, hence no remains. So you have no body to say goodbye to, but you are mostly sure that you know where and somewhat how they died. And there is now a large memorial at the site where you can visit along with others who share your pain. But what if your loved one did not regularly work in the buildings, but perhaps they were more than occasionally there for a meeting or as a delivery driver, or they had some type of reason for occasionally being at that building. And on that day, the plane crashes and you can't get a hold of your loved one. And to this day, they haven't been found. Were they one of the people whose remains were never found amongst the rubble? Or did some other harm come to them that morning? New York is not a city without crime, and all emergency services understandably shifted their focus to the crash site. So if your loved one was a victim of a robbery gone wrong or whatever, it wasn't going to be looked into that day or even the few days afterwards. And in the 14 days since then, we have all come to learn that perpetrators of major crimes that day and in the following few days really got a free pass because there was no law enforcement available to look into these crimes. So now you're wondering, did they go down with the building? Did they meet with foul play elsewhere? Have they run off with an affair partner? Do they have a head injury and they're wandering around never to be seen again? So where the first person in this scenario still has some doubts, they feel fairly confident that they know what happened to their loved one, they know where they can mourn them and who is responsible for their death. They will still have ambiguous grief because they have no body to give them 100% proof of death or to say goodbye to. But for the second person, they are not even sure their loved one is dead. But if they are, how did they die? Where did they die? Who's responsible, and did someone get away with a crime? They have significantly less closure than the first person, and that will result in a more robust ambiguous grief process. So that's an extreme example, but let's look at a regrettably more common example. Those who go missing presumed murdered. Say a young woman left her home to walk down to the shops and a security camera captures her being bundled into a car and no one hears from her again. There can be the assumption that she met with foul play, but the video isn't proof enough that she's been murdered and therefore that the family should go into grief just yet. She may be being held captive somewhere, sold into sex trafficking, or in some old cases planted herself to start a new life. But as time goes on and the case goes cold, the family will naturally start the grieving process of this ambiguous loss. But what if she was abducted, like we said, and during the case the police discover a suspect who admit that he killed her and fed her to his pigs, and there's nothing left even after the police gave the area a good going over. Now there is always the chance that this person is lying, which has certainly been known to happen in a pathetic attempt to take credit for a heinous crime, but let's say he is telling the truth. The family really only have his word to go on, which is where the denial part of grief can really mess with your head, because there's no physical evidence of death. Say then that the police find video for some reason that he recorded of himself putting an obviously dead body in with the pigs and perhaps checking on it later. The family view the video, they are closer to verifying their loved one's death, and there starts to be less denial and more acceptance that their loved one is in fact dead. So you can see how with each new piece of information, the ambiguous grief process can shift a little bit and make a big difference in the healing process. But what does that look like? Hi folks! Okay, I'm aware this is bad timing, but being a death channel, there's not many videos where this would be good timing. So I just wanted to let you guys know that we have started a Patreon for those who would like to support the channel. Currently, we only have 2 membership tiers and we're looking for feedback on those. Tier 1 is $4.99 and you can access a range of downloads such as cheat sheets and ebooks that will be added to on a monthly basis, as well as the occasional live Q&A. Tier 2 is $46 and includes a wide range of things, including a monthly consultation with myself to chat about anything death related. Now, this is all very new to us, so any feedback would be appreciated either in the comments of a video or via an email, which is in the description. Now, as you can tell, I am not a natural salesperson, so the link to the Patreon will be in the description. I am feeling extremely awkward, so let's get back to the video. How to cope. In these circumstances, there are no answers tied up in a neat little bow. For these families, grief becomes entangled with anger, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. And generally, with a death, there is a known mourning process. They are pronounced dead, then you call up the funeral director, make plans to have a funeral with the body in attendance within a week or so, then bury or cremate the body. Burial could be a lot sooner if you are, say, Jewish or Muslim. With a body, you can have a funeral in the traditional sense. But that's not to say that you have no options without a body. You can have a memorial service, which is an event where those who love and mourn the individual come together to share stories and grief together. You may choose to have it set up like a traditional funeral, with everyone seated and instead of a casket up front, a large photo of the individual. But after a funeral, with no body to bury, where do you go to mourn and remember your loved one? Again, you do have options, such as a memorial plot or plaques. You may have seen these around where you live, particularly on park benches and benches overlooking the ocean that had plaques on them dedicated to individuals. Pinaroo Memorial Park that I showed you last year is a space specifically designed for this. You pay for a plaque and a spot on a limestone wall or under a tree or on a rock. Depending on where you have it, you can put cremated remains under it, but any spot can be a memorial spot. In some areas, you are allowed to bury something small where the cremated remains would go, something that symbolizes your loved one in place of their remains. But when it comes to the actual grieving process, there is no path to make it magically better. You will need to work your way slowly through your grief process like any other sort of grief. Their mind will constantly struggle to let go of the absence and the unanswered questions, along with all the usual feelings of grief. And once they think they have accepted the loss, often something will remind them of another question or a what if, and they need to start again. In this case, where general mourning rituals are not possible, you need to get creative, and this is where a grief counsellor comes in handy. Writing letters to the deceased can often be cathartic, for example, as a way to say goodbye. Other memorial ideas that can help with this type of grief include having a teddy bear made out of the person's clothes, having a personalised solar light made so you can quietly sit outside at night and remember your loved one, or making a memory jar where everyone contributes a favourite memory of the deceased and you can read them later when you need to. These are all things that make for a very thoughtful gift or activity at a memorial service. Further down your grief path, there are other ways to work through your grief. If you watch quite a bit of true crime, you will often see families set up charities, awareness organisations or scholarships in honour of their loved one. Others write books about their experience. If it was a mass casualty event, often annual events are organised where loved ones can come together and remember. Many find having a goal like this to be very beneficial in their later stages of grief. Grieving without a body is complex and often overlooked. While some people may say, well, I don't care what happens to my body when I'm gone, for those left behind, it's a different reality. When you lose someone and there's no body to mourn, the emotional and psychological challenges are immense. Denial is strong and acceptance more difficult. The absence of a body makes it so much harder to heal, to say goodbye, or to process the loss. But the key takeaway here is that healing is possible even without a body, and I would strongly recommend a grief counsellor in this situation. And with that, go talk death.